All right, let's do this. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to 1455's author series. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director. If this is your first time checking us out, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spreading the word. And if you're new to the 1455 experience, it's short and sweet. We are a nonprofit. We celebrate storytelling and those who tell stories. We do this primarily by looking at writers, but we also love to talk to musicians, dancers, artists, everyone that is expressing through narrative. And all of our programming year-round is free. You can find out a lot more and get involved at 1455litarts.org. And before I introduce tonight's special guest, Ben Purkert, I'm also happy, as always, that we're partnering with Washington, D.C.'s historic Potter's House. They're a bookstore, a event space in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of D.C. They've been a place for deeper conversation, creative expression, and community transformation. We encourage everyone to buy their books through them, support independent booksellers everywhere, buy multiple copies, especially because you're going to love, if you have not already read, The Men Can't Be Saved. So without further ado, let me introduce Ben, our featured guest tonight. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, Nation, Poetry, Plowshares, Kenyon Review, Tin House, and elsewhere. His poetry collection, For the Love of Endings, was named one of Adroit's best poetry books of the year. He holds degrees from Harvard and NYU, where he was a New York Times fellow. He teaches creative writing at Rutgers, and you can connect with him on Twitter at Ben Purkert, Purkert. This information will all be in the write-up when we share this video on our YouTube page, and of course, on our 1455 site. So let's get down to business. I got a lot to talk about, but Ben, first off, welcome and congratulations. Let me be the first to say tonight, this is what we dream about in this, in our small world of literary solidarity, a great book that reaches an audience and starts to get a reception. I've been reading nothing but good things and seeing you pop up on NPR, Esquire, all richly deserved and awesome. So congratulations and welcome.
Sean, that means so much. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you great.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here virtually, whatever that means. It's an honor to be here, there, friends and family who might be watching. It's good to see you. So I thought, I'd read a little bit from the book, and then we would dive into a conversation. Sound good?
Perfect.
Awesome. This is a part of the book that I haven't read before. I said that once at a reading the other night, forgetting that I had actually read that section. So that was a lie. But this time, unlike Seth, I'm going to not be a liar and I'm going to tell the truth. And this is the first time I've read this section. It's relatively early in the book. It's very early in the book. The main character, Seth, he has a very high opinion of himself. He works as a copywriter at a branding agency called Razorbeat. His boss is named Diego. And he's been hooking up with Josie, who's one of the graphic designers, in Diego's office. And this is a scene that largely takes place in Diego's office. So I think I'll start.
Please do.
I needed a long vacation, by which I mean Razorbeat's HR department needed me to take one. I hadn't ever missed a day of work, so now I was forced to use my weeks or lose them. I told HR I'd valiantly sacrifice, but they objected. What if, they said, others felt pressure to forfeit their vacation time? It could snowball. Razor culture could suffer. In hindsight, I should have pushed back harder. I submitted the PTO request through gritted teeth. My modest bank account balance was going to hamper any vacation plans, so I asked my parents if they'd consider pitching in. Before I could enumerate all the character-building benefits of traveling abroad, my mom's enthusiasm leapt out from the phone. She had the perfect solution, she said, and it wouldn't cost a single dime. Birthright. I had no interest in going to Israel. Growing up, I'd been made to enroll in Jewish sports leagues, attend Jewish band camp, participate in every Jewish or Jewish adjacent activity that my suburban Maryland neighborhood offered. I'd had my fill, in other words. But my mom had a point. Financially, it made sense. I feigned ignorance during the application process to appear a more appealing candidate for indoctrination. Rosh Hashanah? Never heard of it. Shabbat? Not a clue. It worked like magic. As the trip neared, a little excitement took root. I fell prey to erotic fantasies set at the Dead Sea, replete with sunbathing, mud drizzling, titillating trysts of buoyancy. When I told my boss, Diego, that I planned to work during vacation, he took a scolding posture. Give yourself a mental break. What can't wait until you're back? Prostate, I reminded. My latest client was a prostate cancer nonprofit. Small potatoes, Diego said, barely looking up from his desk. We'll find someone to cover. A smile strained him. He nodded it away. Seth, he began, after setting his glasses back in place, I'd like to impart a wee bit of wisdom, a little something I've learned in the course of my many trips around the sun. I'd never heard him lecture before, or rather the transitive form. I'd never heard him lecture me. People, he continued, are very beautiful, very complex creatures. But in many ways, we're no different from computers. Even brilliant creatives like you and me, from time to time, he extended an open hand to his laptop. It's important to reboot. You'd be surprised, he added, how much it can fix. He smiled again, less strain in his teeth. Then he spun away toward his window and adjusted the shades, letting in a sudden flood of light. I stood by, silent and illuminated, as he checked email on his phone. My attention lingered not on his words, but on his window. Why, I wondered, weren't his shades open in the first place? It wasn't like him to leave them drawn so late in the day. I confronted a frightful possibility. Had I been careless during one of the prior nights and forgotten to open them back up? As he thumbed at his phone screen, I scrutinized the calm of his face for a flicker of suspicion. Did he open the shades to send me a message, to signal what he knew? It suddenly hit home how reckless Josie and I were being. We were only fooling around, sure, but we were risking our future at the agency. Though my future, I reminded myself, was its own entity. It had nothing to do with hers. Diego's mind was on his phone. Its glare rippled across his sloping brow. Hey, I gestured to his teak figurine. It sat on the middle shelf to his right. I like that thing a lot, I said. He peeled himself away from whatever held his attention. Where'd you get it? I asked. A gift from a client? He shook his head no. Was it that East Village sculptor? Is that the one who made it? Not quite, he said. I could never afford one of his. He swiveled and, with a curator's care, scooped it up from the base. I nabbed this at auction years ago, he said, probably a good decade before you were born. He held it up to the window's light where it found an added gleam. Can I have it? I asked. The sunlight was beating hard against Diego's bald head. I could see the outline of where hair might have sprouted had he let it, and where there was simply no hope. I shot off some random explanation for why I liked it so much, something about the form, the style, the aesthetic, whatever. So, I said, pushing my hard stare on him, practically through him, can I have it? It already belonged to me anyway. I'd marked my territory, and that included his office and everything in it. Maintaining eye contact with him, I summoned my upper body into a subtle flex, and my modest musculature complied as best it could, testing my shirt at a few seams, stretching toward intimidation. Hadn't Diego often referred to me as the future of Razorbeat? Well, gaze upon me then, the future, here in the flesh. He dragged his forefinger down and around the figurine's waist, slowly, as if taking some important measurement or weighing some important thought. Then he swiveled away from the window and back toward the shelf. Sadly, my dear, he replied, it's one of a kind. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. As I said before we came on live, I've got so many questions. I'm sure we'll cover a few of them, but one of the best compliments I can offer is that while I was reading this, I was already seeing the movie, which is an interesting headspace. It's one thing to finish a book and realize, oh yeah, that's going to make for a good movie. But I could see this. I think in part, everyone that reads this, no matter where they are professionally and what their age is, everyone knows these people. And yet not everyone knows these people, which is probably the best kind of jumping off point, which is most of us would agree, right? That the best and worst advice to any writer is write about what you know. Whether that's true or not, I think it would be helpful for people to understand that you're pretty close to some of this material based on the life you've led. So maybe talk a little bit about how this is and isn't drawn from your own experience, professionally and otherwise.
Yeah. So my first job out of college was working as a tagline copywriter at a branding agency that looks a lot like Razorbeat. So, that was my first gig. And the whole time I was there, I had tremendous respect for my colleagues who did the work, some of whom loved the work, some of whom hated the work. But I knew pretty early on that it was just not going to be the career that I wanted. I would rather try to, fail at being a creative writer rather than succeed at doing this branding thing. And once you realize that, it's really clarifying in terms of where to take a career. Even though financially it was a terrible decision, it was still a move toward a passion of mine. But I think the cool thing was that, since I knew early on, okay, this is not going to be my career, this is not going to be my livelihood, I could immediately establish a kind of distance from it and see it maybe a little bit more objectively, which I think is maybe, the struggle a little bit with that, right, what you know line from Grace Paley, which I love that line. But I think that if you're in something, if you're really in it, sometimes it's hard to have the distance you need. But if you know, like, okay, this job, I'm not long for it, suddenly you recede a little bit from your landscape and you can see it more clearly, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a craft lesson in there too, right? You talk about distance and you talk about this kind of objectivity. I think by having that distance and being able to see so clearly what you didn't like or what didn't fulfill you, which clearly can apply to many other people in that world or in the corporate environment. This enables you, even if you didn't have this experience, what better metaphor for our contemporary kind of angst than this world of spinning taglines and this whole notion of authenticity and what is it? And if you feel it, it's real, and image is everything. And then the hollowness, I think you've already alluded, even if you succeed, what are you succeeding at? So I think you stumbled, on this ready-made environment that's just so ripe for satire, but man, the satire hits pretty hard because it's so obviously true.
Yeah, I think a book, I don't know how many folks have read Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End, but I was working at the agency when I read that book. And if you haven't read that book, it's hilarious. And it's a take. Joshua Ferris, amazing novelist. He started out as a copywriter at an ad agency too. And our books do different things, but when I read that book, it was revelatory because it was so funny and it tapped into the sheer absurdity of working at an agency. And I was working at the agency during the Great Recession. I got hired in 2007 and then 2008 hit. And suddenly a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues were losing their jobs. All of us were sort of on thin ice. It added tension to every interaction, right? Every time the client emailed you and said, hey, we don't like this, you knew you could lose that client and you could lose your job the next day, which was a really difficult place emotionally to live. But I think a novel thrives in that kind of tension. So, reading his book and just going to work every day, knowing, this could be my last day of work, I'm not surprised, I guess, on some level that I wanted to write this book. I am surprised at how long it took me. It took about 10 years, but I still needed to get there.
Yeah, and I have a question about that, but before we get to that, I think what's also, in hindsight anyway, interesting and very depressing is that in American culture anyway, when we have these calamities, it somehow kind of sets the template for the new normal. And I feel like this constant fear of being replaced or being expendable, which to various extents has always existed in a corporate arena, but that has just having not been in copywriting, but having been in the corporate world for quite a few years, I could relate immediately to just this pervasive feeling of doom. Like there is no security. Does anyone have your back? Is anyone looking out for you? And again, I think the novel has a lot of fun, really taking a deeper dive into these pathologies of you only succeed if you don't trust anyone. And if you only look out for yourself, you're in better shape. But again, what is the collateral damage to your soul? So again, I think the world that you depict here feels so real in part because it's not that different in a lot of ways to what so many people experience on the daily.
Thank you for saying that. And also, I think my parents are watching. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Hopefully you figured out the Facebook Live thing. So if not, you can text me. But my parents were laid off. The company that they worked for a combined like 50, 55, 60 years. Just 1 year, they got acquired by a bigger company and they lost their jobs. And I was in high school. And thankfully we were okay financially. It wasn't, it didn't uproot our lives the way that can for so many other families.
Yep.
But it was also a struggle. I think they would tell you that. Like, what do you do when you work for a company for that long? My character Seth doesn't work at Razorbeat for that long, but everything about a company, everything about a corporation, an agency, they give you that merch on purpose, right? You're supposed to have the business cards. You're supposed to have the t-shirts. You're like, it's insidious, which is not to say that all corporations are evil necessarily, although we could talk about that. But you form an identity based on that work. And then one day you show up and your desk is just Windex clean. And my character, he really struggles to move on from that. And to me, that's what makes him such a tragic comic figure. On the one hand, he's such a jerk in so many ways that I think a reader would be totally fair in rooting for his downfall. On the other hand, he's so naked before this corporate America thing that is so much larger than him. And to me, that makes him endearing, or at least vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think you just nail something really important that I certainly want to call attention to, Ben, which is I think a less experienced, less talented writer wouldn't have been able to kind of thread that line between a character who's obviously a rascal, and never do well, full of himself, gets his comeuppance. But because there's so much context about the world that he and so many of us have to sink or swim in, you can't help. And again, so the writing and the characterization helps us want to root for him and ultimately really be invested in his story. Because again, I think what's happening to any sensitive reader is an acknowledgement there, but for the grace of God goes so many of us. But you hit on something a minute ago that I wanted to also call attention to, which is this weird kind of perverse thing where for men anyway, I think it's for everyone, but certainly for men, we are taught, it's inculcated that our job is our identity. So when people meet at a party, what do you do is the first question. Right. And so you really reveal, in great detail how a person's whole identity can be shattered if that's suddenly taken away. And that plays at all kinds of levels of loyalty and the ways in which an identity can be so tenuous.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I mean, I think one of the things that is great about travel, and I'm not someone who, I've traveled to some extent, but I haven't traveled that widely. But when you leave the US and go to other countries and experience other traditions, you see your own traditions in a new light, right? And so you go to a party in a different in Europe, for example. The first question isn't what do you do? It's like the approach into that conversation looks so different here than it does in other places. And again, it's not that it's wrong necessarily, but when you zoom out, you're like, well, why is that how we begin our interactions? Like, why is that the defining characteristic? What else could it be? What other ways might we have into a conversation with another person? What do you love? What are you afraid of? What do you, where were you born? Like anything, right? But what do you do only reinforces that functionality. And when that's taken away from Seth, I think it rocks his manhood for sure, but I think it also rocks just his sense of self.
Yeah, and then he has a crisis of identity and employment early on. Spoiler alert, but it happens pretty early on. But then his journey could be characterized a lot of different ways. But for me, the through line I kept thinking of was this dueling search for authenticity and intimacy. Again, you really spend a lot of time in this deeply uncomfortable space of how men in particular, I think modern men, have so many issues with intimacy, not just with women and not just with oneself, but with other men. And the novel does a wonderful job. And I have not read a lot of fiction that really gets to that level of what a real societal issue that is. This inability for men to be able to be honest and vulnerable with each other.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you watch Succession at all? Are you a Succession fan?
I've seen it. Yeah.
Okay. My favorite, for folks who've watched it, and I know it's a polarizing show, sort of like Mad Men, where the people who I love Mad Men, so it's my favorite show, but other people, have a different reaction to it.
Yeah.
But my favorite scenes in Succession are with Tom and Greg. And there's just like such a charged energy, and you feel like are they going to like beat the shit out of each other? Are they going to start making out? Like what they clearly are so deeply invested in each other. But as two heterosexual men, you feel the limitations of their intimacy vocabulary. Like they don't know how to express the complexity of what they're feeling. And I think that when I think about how I grew up, and I'm not talking so much about like male role models in my life, so much as maybe just like pop culture, like whether it's Homer Simpson or any sort of masculine archetype.
Yeah. What
defines them is their inarticulateness with regard to any sort of feeling. And so for me, the book, the part of the book, I don't know if it's my favorite part of my novel, which is a weird thing to say, right? I'm not supposed to have a favorite part of my own book, but the part that I had the most fun writing were the scenes with Seth and Moon. Because here we have these two guys who just desperately need a friend, they need touch, they need closeness, and they don't have a damn clue how to begin admitting to that. And so, that I think is what makes them unsavable on some level.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the title and the many layers that plays on. It's a perfect title for the book. It fits it, like a glove, and it's without this language, without this ability to be vulnerable. And again, when it's inculcated that being vulnerable is a way to fail, what do men turn to? Being inarticulate, violence, drugs, drinking, finding identity in a very style over substance kind of sustenance, which of course can't sustain itself, especially if you aren't getting a paycheck. But there you see the ripple effects of without a sense of self, without a sense of self-worth, it's easy to see how men become prey to all these competing forces, all this malevolence that leads to addiction and violence and lack of intimacy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that I'm not a sociologist. I'm a poet and a novelist, but that was on some deep level what I wanted to explore. And the crisis for my character, there's the immediate crisis, which is he's lost his job.
Right.
But beneath that, the deeper crisis is like, where are his friends? Where are the people who are looking out for him? And, you know, there've been a lot of articles lately about male loneliness and male suicide rates and male depression. And, you know, when I started the book 10 years ago, I don't think I was consciously thinking about those things.
Right.
But I also am aware of the fact that, you know, 10 years ago, I had more male friends in my life than I have now. You know, my life is really rich. I've got 2 kids and wonderful partner, and, you know, my students who I love, but a lot of those friendships atrophy. And I think when I look at some of the women in my life, that's not necessarily the case. So I don't know, maybe that's weirdly personal, but
No, not at all.
you start out writing a book, and Lord knows I did not try to write this book to be topical or trendy. I wrote it because I just kind of wanted to play and experiment and try my hand at fiction. But then the world changes and you publish a book, and then it enters a kind of discourse, whether you mean to or not, I think.
Well, and there's a great moral to that story too, right? Which, again, as a teacher, I'm sure you've told your students, you have to write something that is going to be meaningful to you. Chasing trends is usually the enemy of art, in part because even if you successfully chase a particular trend, by the time that book comes to publication date, there's a new trend. The zombie has become the superhero or whatever. So
Yeah.
when I said at the outset that I really wanted to celebrate the deserved success this is getting, that's part of it, knowing that this was very much a labor of love. And you alluded to it, but I want to call attention to the fact that, of course, it shouldn't matter because the work ultimately has to speak for itself and account for itself. But it does take extra layers, for me anyway, knowing that a writer put a lot of themselves into the work. Talk a little bit about the fact that your background is as a poet, and that this book didn't happen, what I wrote in my notes, with, shall we say, a Stephen King type pace. I started it in March and it was available in October. That was not the case in this instance.
No, it's the worst, right? And it's so funny because I respect every writer's process. I know, different writers work at their own pace, and it's not bad being slow, but on some level, it's just like, come on, man. No one should be able to write a novel in a year, let alone a good novel. If you're publishing a novel in a year, I want it to stink. I want it to be bad, because I'm out here, struggling with my fellow slow writers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my background is in poetry. I published a book of poems in 2018, and I approach fiction as a poet. And that, I think, is both a blessing and a curse. Part of what took so much time is that I'm used to just thinking on a smaller scale. I'm used to polishing every phrase and caring deeply about every word. I think that's a great practice to have as a writer, but this novel, it's not that long of a novel, but I think it's around 80,000 words. The scale of that makes my process so taxing. So I'm interested to see what I plan to keep writing novels if I have them in me, and poems too, but I'll be interested to see if my habits change and things accelerate, or if this is just sort of the way that I move, which is sort of in miniature in a way.
Isn't it fascinating though? I mean, one of the last thing I want to do is talk about myself at all, but I can relate only in the sense that I've published poetry, I've published fiction. And I mean, there is something very interesting about not just the way one writes, but the way one thinks. And one can spend years on a particular poem, but that's usually revision and tweaking. The fact of the matter is, producing a 1 or 2 page poem or a 5 or 6 line poem is just a shorter engagement. So I've caught myself, however pretentious it sounds, thinking when I've worked on certain longer fiction, it's like I'm thinking novelistically. But there's something to that, because you're thinking in dialogue, you're thinking in pace, you're thinking in plot, and you have to be cognizant of the start and end point. Where with a poem, I think there is kind of this without a net, be as long as it needs to be, but you almost are, the page itself sets certain boundaries, where with a novel, right, it could start and you don't really know where it's going to go.
Yeah. And for folks who, not who joined late, but who joined on time, but Sean and I were talking about his book of short stories, which is coming out relatively soon. And the short story, like that's a whole other form unto itself. A lot of writers have talked about the short story being the hardest genre to work in, actually, which I feel like the hardest genre to work in is whatever one you're currently working in. Like when I'm working on my poems, I'm always like, damn it, poems are the hardest. And then when I'm working on the novel, it's like, no, this is the hardest. I'm a complainer by nature, but I do think there is something to that with the short story. But I didn't know the end of this novel when I began it. And I know that there are two types. There's the type of novelist who maps everything out and has a really detailed outline. And then there's the other one who just flies by the seat of their pants. And I'm much more the latter, in part, I think, for my own interest. Like, I'm not sure I could have worked on a novel for 10 years if I had known the ending. Like, that's the ultimate spoiler, you know? I want to discover. I want to get somewhere that I hadn't seen. I want to be surprised, which I think is something that I learned as a poet.
Yeah.
But you pay for it maybe because, I wrote this thing that I liked the wildness, I liked the curvature, I liked the weirdness of the movement of the story, but then I had to polish it and revise, and there was a lot of time spent on the back end.
Yeah, and I think one need not compare the different art forms, especially because people get very touchy. But
Yeah.
the fact of the matter is, a novel is an investment of time, and there is a sense of, I know I've been through it writing a novel. You do go through these phases where you're like, what if this doesn't work? How much time have my life have I invested? And of course, that ultimately becomes a really good kind of sensibility check. I think you do, or some of us get to a point where you really can look in the proverbial mirror and say, it doesn't matter. I have to see this through. And that becomes its own reward. But I'm also reminded of a great, I return to this George Orwell quote a lot, where he says something along the lines of, writing a novel is a horrible, exhausting process, like a long sickness. One would never undertake such a thing unless they were driven by some force. But there's some truth to that. To have the endurance to do it, it probably is like training for a marathon. You just don't do it for fun. You have to push yourself through that.
Yeah. Do you know that? Is it Joyce Carol Oates, that quote about writing a novel is like pushing a bean across a warehouse with only your nose or something? Just this amazing image. Every writer wants to glorify or call attention to the labor of writing because it's that too, I think, is a function of capitalism. Like, we need to be perceived as working really hard, even though, let's face it, like my job most of the time is doing exactly what I'm doing right now. Like, it's sitting in front of a desk and typing. It's not actually physically all that demanding, but
Right.
The labor of a novel, if not physical, is it's a journey.
Sure.
So at the other side of that warehouse, there better be like something, right? Like whether it's a pot of gold, and it's not a pot of gold because novelists don't make as much as poets think that they make. But for me, it was the ending. It was the not knowing. Otherwise, there's no way I'm putting in that amount of time,
Yeah, and I love, I love kind of the inherent tension. I mean, when you were talking earlier, I was just thinking, Bill Friedkin, great director, just passed, so he's been on my mind. But I'm so, when we start talking about craft, you've got on one end, right? You've got the Stanley Kubrick, who 100 takes isn't enough. I'll do 100 more if I need to. And then someone like Friedkin, who's like 1 or 2 takes at the most. I want to capture the spontaneity. And who's to say, what's more authentic, what's more effective? I think when you setting a bar pretty high, or what your vision is, you've already thought about it in advance. I think that applies to writing too. So if it flows freely on some days and it's very slow paced on other days, I think there's still that process of wanting to surprise yourself and being open to that discovery.
Yep.
Knowing where it's going to lead. Like I'd be curious if you can, how you deal with that in the classroom as a teacher. I'm sure you deal with students that all have their different processes, and the common theme being, you've got to be, if you can't be interested in what you're doing, how do you expect a potential reader to be interested or engaged with what you're doing?
Yeah. 100%. And I think, listen, I'm, as a teacher, pedagogically, as a person, I want to be open to all processes. I don't, I'm not going to ever evangelize and say my way is the right way.
Yeah.
But under my breath, if I'm being totally honest, I often can tell when a book has been plotted in advance, like too heavily. Like I think that it's hard to hide. And maybe I'm just not a good actor. I know that I'm not a good actor, but sometimes I pick up a novel and I just, I get to that ending and I'm like, you knew this ending the whole time. And I don't always like that feeling because it feels a little bit, what is the exercise of writing a novel that every twist and turn along the way? Like it's not that I'm saying it's not a worthy creative project. I'm not saying that at all, but isn't the discovery, isn't the change, isn't that like sort of integral to making art? If you know exactly what you want to write before you write it, then what are you doing in writing it? Like that always just seems like a job to me. So making art is, I think, about the unknown and is about, oh, I thought I knew where this was going to go, but then the character got up and walked out of the room and made this crazy decision and went in this other direction. And now it's like, I've got two choices. I can either follow this piece of paper that I wrote a year ago that tells me what the plot should be, or I can get up out of the room and follow my character. And the fact that he's walking to his car right now and it's thunderstorming and that's where I want to go. I want to go there. So all this to say, when I'm in the classroom, try to be very open-minded. Everyone, if you've got an outline, if you don't have an outline, everyone is welcome here. But in my heart of hearts, I have a bias like anyone else.
Yeah, and I think, but I really do think you touch on something really profound there, which is most writers talk about the process and talk about these moments, right? These ecstatic moments where they don't know where a certain idea, and that gets into notions of the subconscious and the creative impulse and so forth. But I really like the way you articulate kind of when it seems too telegraphed. And then I think that opens up a conversation about, plot versus narrative and exposition. And I have to say two things. One, I had no idea how this was going to end. And I'm usually pretty good about that. Like my spidey senses for pop culture, like when I'm watching especially like Netflix series and stuff, I'm like, I know exactly what's going to happen. So there was an element of surprise there for sure. But I think there's also something inherent about respecting the process, and it need not sound pretentious to just assert what you're talking about, which is allow yourself to be surprised and it'll feel fresher. And it might go in places that transcend what your original conception was.
Yeah. And also sometimes it goes in the wrong direction too, right? I mean, sometimes you have an impulse and it's not the right one, and the original conception is what you need to go back to. But I don't know. I'm a big believer in when there's a fork in the road, you sort of have to take it. You know what I mean? Like I don't want to have an allegiance to a preconception and then in so doing close my eyes or close my ears to what my character is telling me. Like if my character is telling me something, I gotta listen to that, because if I don't, then they're just a piece of cardboard.
Right. Well, I'm curious now that we've opened that box over the course of a decade, give or take, did you have some forks in the road that surprised you and kind of required you to make some difficult or challenging choices that did require you to maybe throw away aspects that you'd already worked on?
Oh, for sure. I mean, one of the things I struggled with this book was in the section that I read, the character talks about going to Birthright. He ultimately does go to Birthright. Yeah. That was a section that I wrote really early on, and it always just felt like, and I still, I mean, hopefully we'll get more reviews for the book, and so we'll see, right? But I think a reviewer would be totally right to say, this Birthright chapter doesn't really fit into the flow of this novel, because I felt that, and on some level I still feel that it's a diversion. But I tried it so many different ways. I tried moving it up, I tried moving it back, I tried cutting it entirely. And each time I just felt like I missed it. And so sometimes you gotta keep it in, I think. Like sometimes, one of the things that I'm have a tendency to do sometimes is over revise. Like I want it to be so polished. And I had a poetry professor named Jory Graham in college who told me, you know, Ben, sometimes you revise the poem right out of the poem. And in your effort to like polish every surface, you're losing the poeminess, like you're losing the art of this a little bit. And
Yes.
eventually it was like, you know what? I like this birthright chapter. And I think it adds something. And so even if the shape of the novel gets a little oblong, that's okay. A lot of my favorite novels have weird, you know, sort of sections that move in different directions. Or like some of my favorite TV shows are those bottle episodes where, you know, like Seinfeld would do that, or Mad Men would do that, where we're just going to like live in the delivery room for this episode, or we're going to follow Don Draper to California, and it's, you know, you're just going to do it and then you're going to come back. So I think that too is something that like any writer needs to be cognizant of. What do you sometimes fixate on, and then how can you push back against that impulse?
Yeah, and listen, I think I say kind of with a wink and a nod, and also like a big fist bump. That's the soul of a sensibility of a poet. I think talking that doesn't hurt you, to have this kind of inherent appreciation of language for language's sake, but really understanding having something that is sacrificing the soul for perfection or aesthetic perfection, which seldom is achieved anyway.
Right.
I love the quote, and Jory Graham, you know, big shout out. I think she's a genius. Yeah, I mean, over plotting, over revising, trying to keep it fresh. I think some of this goes into the whole getting into craft, right? The idea of you do your work behind the scenes so that it looks effortless. You do the agonizing off the page so that it does look like it flowed and it had to be written that way. But I think what your story about this novel illustrates is it's a lot of work to do that for some of us. And at times it maybe happens more easily, and that's great. But the reality is, you know, it's hard work, and it does require false starts, and the cultivation of, I think, an instinct about what goes where and what works. And for the record, the scene in Israel I thought was perfect, because we're on this roller coaster of a workplace story, and I was there for it. But then all of a sudden we really are into, oh no, we're getting into much more deep kind of philosophical identity grounds. So just one critic's opinion, but I thought it was, I think I understood what you were doing and why it was the right place to peel a few more layers of the onion. Like we're going to be going a lot deeper than just a workplace comedy.
Well, thank you. And please grab a megaphone and go to goodreads.com and let everyone know, because some of the 1 stars are less than convinced. But no, I appreciate that sincerely. Thank you.
Well, and you know, I'm glad you actually mentioned that. I mean, we would be remiss. We were talking before we came live about, and I'd love to talk a little bit and hear your experience. You know, we were kind of half joking, half seriously talking about the whole notion of publicity and the different hats, an artist. I won't even say a writer, right? Because certainly this applies to musicians. You know, it's now just understood at this juncture in the 21st century, no writer or very few writers can afford to be aloof to social media, marketing, promotions, being at least somewhat savvy in the art of reaching and cultivating an audience. And that includes soliciting reviews and then being at the mercy of the haters.
Yep, for sure. I mean, I think, and you know, listen, I'm honestly so game for different people to have different reactions to the book. Like one of the things, I got this great text from a friend just a couple of days ago, who said that his wife had read the book and she loved the main character. She found him so endearing and funny. But my friend was like, this guy is so conceited, like I can't stand him. And then he said, you know, I love that it's eliciting these 2 totally different responses in the household. And maybe that's the sign that you've created a complex character, which is that different reasonable people can fall on different sides. Are we rooting for Seth or are we rooting against him? And if someone is just uninterested in rooting for a character, then I can certainly understand why they'd have a negative response to the book, and I truly get that. I think what we were talking about earlier is that I did leave the branding industry because I wanted to do this creative writing thing. I wanted to do this poetry thing. I wanted to do this fiction thing, this art thing, which felt so different than branding, creating a frame or spinning something or promoting something. And it's true. I mean, being a writer in the 21st century, and I realize how lucky I am. It's really hard to get a book published. I'm incredibly blessed. But we do put a lot of pressure on authors to be the brand ambassadors for their book and to send emails and to post about it all the time. And the way I rationalize it is, look, I spent 10 years on this book and I'm proud of it. So hopefully for a month, folks can just stomach me, megaphoning about it and being proud of it. But it's hard. It's a hard ask for the author. And I will say that, it's cool it's cool that someone like Elena Ferrante can break out in the way that she does, because, she's someone who has managed to remain completely anonymous, and, no one knows who she is, and no social media presence. And I hope that there's always space for that kind of writer. I hope that there's always a readership for the writer who just doesn't want to promote, doesn't want to be visible, just does their work at a desk and somehow it makes it out into the world. I think it would be a huge loss if we made that person's path, so full of obstruction that we never get to read the work.
Well, I wasn't planning on going in this direction, but you make me think of a pretty interesting kind of conflation, which is, we start out the discussion talking about the corporate world and this authenticity crisis of a late capitalist consumer competition world, but that applies to artists too, right? I mean, if you aren't a happy warrior most days, writing about what you feel deeply about and trying to engage in an audience in a way that is palatable for you, I think, in just like the corporate world, if your whole identity is caught up in how many reviews you got, how many likes you're generating, or, if you're the flavor of the day that particular day, I think most of us recognize that's a hard treadmill to stay on. And that brass ring, I think we all root each other on and hope. I want every writer to succeed. But the reality is, if in your day in and day out, you're not fundamentally secure and happy about who you are and what you're doing, no amount of success is going to, change that either.
Yeah, it's true. And it can easily just become another rat race. But, I say that, and at the same time, like, I've been so blessed the last couple of weeks. I mean, I've lived a lucky life in many ways, but getting to share this book, I worked on it a long time, right? I put in 10 years. So I feel like I've earned something in that regard, but this is also the first piece of fiction that I've really written. So, on the one hand, I think, God, I've worked myself to the bone. On the other hand, what an amazing coup, really. And the fact that I got to take this book, which I never thought would be shared with others outside of a few friends and my partner and my parents, and the fact that it gets to be published and that I get to have conversations like this with folks like you, with other writers, with readers, it's an enormous gift. So yes, even though the self-promotion thing, at times I feel like I'm still in the branding world. It's just that I am my own product all of a sudden, and that feels a little uncomfortable for me. I wouldn't really change much. It's cool to see a piece of writing connect in the way that it connected with my friend, right? Which is that he and his wife had such different reactions. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we also had mentioned before we came live, look, I mean, we need to demystify, or maybe that's not the word I'm looking for, but we need to disabuse ourselves of, if not us, who? Artists need to lift one another up. I think, again, it tends to become a zero-sum game, especially on social media, where I see people that at times seem reluctant to show up for their colleagues and their peers. And it's like, no one else is going to do it. We need to lead by example. So, to me, the proof is in the pudding. This book wouldn't be getting the attention that it is getting if it wasn't good. So I'm the first one to say, you go, bask in it, celebrate it. And just hearing you talk about the process and how hard you worked on it, I think it's clear that it's not in you to be full of yourself or take this for granted. You put in the time. So, man, if we can't celebrate an achievement like this, then we're doing the wrong thing. So, hell yeah for that.
Thank you. And also I would say, one piece of advice, I'm not like on high trying to give advice, but this helped me tremendously. My friend, the poet Ruth Mayevsky, she wrote an amazing novel. I loved her poems. And then she made the move into fiction around the same time I did. And she is someone who I had not met in person for a long time, but we just liked each other's poems. We started talking online, and we were trying to get an agent around the same time. And then we were both on submission, just meaning like, the agent takes the book and then sends it around to editors. And it's a very stressful time as a writer, because
right.
You're hoping, the right editor says yes. And Ruth and I went through the process together, and I have a ton of respect and love for her novel, and she really loves and respects mine. And her book came out just a couple of weeks ago. For anyone listening, All Night Pharmacy, it's a terrific book. But what helped me a lot with the self-promotion was, you know what? I'm going to be Ruth's cheerleader. Like, I obviously I want my book to do well, but whenever she gets good news, I'm going to treat it like I'm going to get good news. Whenever she gets a big review somewhere, I'm going to retweet it and shout about her. And she's done that for me. And it has made the process truly, and also her book has been, it's getting so much deserved buzz and attention. It's allowed me actually to find some peace in this, because just shouting about yourself, it's tiresome. But when you go through it with a friend, right? And that's sort of what we were talking about earlier, like the importance of friendship and closeness. So my advice to any writer is that, find that friend, that honest friend whose successes you can treat as your own, and, make their success your goal, right? Because your own success you can't control, but I don't know, it's been helpful to me.
I love it. That's so soulful. I certainly can relate to that. I endorse that. Ben, you've given me a lot to think about, and a lot to celebrate, because look, just having this series, being able to read a book that I really enjoy spending time with, and having the opportunity to talk, that's a win. But having been doing this for many years, probably like any endeavor, certainly any creative endeavor, it ultimately, so many of these conversations I have tend to boil down to a few key things that not surprisingly come up over and over again, especially in the context of when we're asked, like, in 2023, what's the hack? Like, yeah. But how do I get my novel to market? It's like, if it was easy and there was a shortcut, a lot more people would be doing it. But we've talked tonight about authenticity in the process, writing from the heart, however goofy that sounds, it's very real. And this notion of being part of a community, being part of something larger than yourself. There is karma in that, but I think you prove that does lift up others, and you're lifting yourself up in the process. It makes the artistic process bigger than what's often a very solitary world that's filled with silence and rejection. That type of communal support can be, very contagious.
Well, thank you. And remind me the name of your book.
The book is coming out in 2024. It's called This Kind of Man.
This Kind of Man. I can't wait for it. You should all hop on it. I can't wait to do that. And then there's also this one. This is me. So
yeah, look, the men can't be saved. Folks, jump on the bandwagon. You're not too late. You're late. If you're just hearing about this, I'm delighted to be helping introduce, but go to our Facebook page, go to my Facebook page. There's links to the Esquire interview, the NPR, a bunch of it. Go to Ben's website. Is it benpurkert.com?
Yep.
Yeah. I'll put all the links in our follow-up, but go read some of the interviews, check out the vibes, but read this book. And we didn't get to this, but maybe the next time we talk, Ben, we'll have a little bit of an update on when this is going to be made into a movie, because there's just no way that that's not going to happen. It's too ready-made. It's too timely. It's too perfect for stimulating conversations like this, which, look, we need to be having. So I thank you again for being able to talk craft, being able to talk about your book, but the themes within the book are very timely and relevant issues that we all should be talking about.
Thank you, Sean. We need Hollywood to start paying the writers and the actors, because until that strike is over, there's no movie to be made. But in all seriousness, I really appreciate it. And when your book comes out, I'd love to be in discussion with you, hyping it up and sharing it. So
well, that's super kind of you. But again, I want the focus tonight to be entirely on this guy and this book. Phenomenal achievement, Ben. Congratulations. We're going to be hearing more from you. And again, I'm absolutely delighted to be a tiny part of this journey you're on. And I wish you all the best.
Thanks so much, Sean. Take care.
All right, we'll talk to you soon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. 1455litarts.org. Go to Potter's House, buy several copies, support independent writers, support the artistic community, and everyone be productive, be safe, and be well. We'll see you soon.